Search intent, as you know it, is a load of bollocks. I know that sounds a bit harsh, but if you bear with me throughout this talk, I hope I can prove to you why. But in order to do so, we need to understand some psychology, and understanding this will help you understand some of the theories that we're going to look into and give you a better understanding of everything that we're going to talk about overall. So we're talking about confirmation bias today. So in order to understand confirmation bias, we need to understand what cognitive biases are. So cognitive biases are errors in thinking which we're often unaware of, which impact our ability to make judgments. And why do they happen? Well, as people, we're not very good at making quick decisions, and we're not very good at making rational decisions either, which is why we use heuristics to help us. As you can see in this diagram, heuristics are kind of fast, unconscious decisions that we make, everyday decisions that we make, for example, like opening the door, opening the fridge, going to work, all those kind of things that don't take much mental effort. But the problem is with them, they're prone to mistakes because they're done so quickly. Whereas rational thinking, it's slow, conscious, it's used for kind of life-changing decisions like, should I move state? Should I apply to grad school? Stuff like that. But it's a lot more reliable because we take the time to sit down and think about it. Moving on, something a little bit separate, but something also important is categorization. So as people, we need to understand the world that we live in. And in order to do that, we use something called categorization. And this is a process of sorting objects, experiences, and even people into groups or classes. So you can see here, for example, we're grouping trees into different types of trees. When it comes to people, unfortunately, this does have some undesired side effects, but we group people into, for example, cat people versus dog people. We group people into, for example, football fans versus rugby fans. You can have people, for example, from Dublin, people not from Dublin, from the countryside, and you can see these little rivalries, but it does have some undesired side effects, which we're going to take a look at in a second. So there's something called social identity theory, and social identity theory is a very important theory and one of my favorite theories that I use to explain kind of how people work in social groups and why we have this us versus them. So people have their own personal identity and they feel a sense of worth from their personal identity. They like identity signaling, they like what they like and they like showing off what they like. And this kind of transforms also into what's called a social identity. So when you have people who, have friends, hang around with social groups, and these social groups all take different forms of identity. You can see it in the SEO industry, for example, where you have different communities and they have their own separate identity, and so on. When it comes to these social identities, so people categorize people into different groups to better understand and know where to place people. So, for example, again, this is where you're going to have the football fans versus rugby fans or other different comparisons. But the only problem is that when you're doing all of these comparisons, psychologically, people prefer people who are closer to them. So they have a preference for in-groups, which is the groups that are like them, and a dislike for out-groups, which are people that are different for them. And this is where you have kind of this comparison and stereotyping, and where the bad sides of this us versus them kind of come into play, because you have, for example, vaxxers versus anti-vaxxers, and you can see where I'm going with that, and it has, as I said, pretty undesirable side effects. But moving on from some of the basic psychological theories that we're looking at, we need to take a look at how search works. But rather than taking a look at how search works from like an SEO perspective, we need to understand the psychological processes that go into it. So searchers go to a search engine, they make their search, and they select the information that they want to look at. They explore websites, they evaluate the information, and then decide what they're going to do with the information, if they're going to make a purchase, if they're going to share the information on the website. And as you can see, it's a little bit different. It's not kind of, everybody sits down and searches for a keyword. There are set processes that go into this. And this also leads into how content's distributed. So you can see where SEO comes in the greater scale of things. And this is really important that we understand, because this helps us understand misinformation and how all of this stuff goes viral. So you have, for example, your own media, which is your website, your blog, your social media, your online content, and you can see, again, this screams SEO. You've got your earned media, so that's if people like you and your content. So it's your mentions, your shares, your reposts, your reviews, everything that you earn from people by creating this good content. You've got your paid media. So you've got, for example, PPC, display, influencer campaigns, social ads. It also links in to SEO because of the way, SEO works and often goes hand in hand with paid media as well. The problem is with this is where misinformation and disinformation and malinformation all kind of come in together. So just so you know, misinformation is a false information that spreads regardless of intent. You've got disinformation, which is created deliberately to harm, manipulate, or mislead. And you've also got malinformation as well, which is based on fact, but taken out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. And this is where all of the problem starts. So let's dive in and actually take a look at confirmation bias and the impacts that this has on search. So before we dive in, of course, we need to understand what confirmation bias is. So confirmation bias is the human tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information which confirms our existing beliefs. You can see in this diagram that you've got your beliefs, you've got the facts and evidence, and you only believe a little bit of the facts and evidence that overlaps with your belief. And the rest of the time, you just ignore it. So you can understand why it's getting a bit dangerous with people, wanting to confirm their existing beliefs that may not be correct and ignoring the rest. So I took a look at a number of papers and made a sort of case study looking at medical related content. So to set the scene, vaccination rates are an all-time low, and this of course poses risks not just for unvaccinated children but also vaccinated populations. And we can see kind of what's been going on in Ireland, for example, that cases of measles, mumps, all of the things that had been eradicated due to vaccines are actually popping up again because of unvaccinated populations. How this relates to SEO? Well, 41% of information-seeking parents actually use the internet to look for information about vaccines. And this statistic is true. Today, this has been, mentioned in research papers that have been made over the last year or so since 2023. And I think it's likely to go up now even more, in 2024 and beyond. And studies have shown as well that parents who don't vaccinate their children are more likely to have found information online. And people's scores on the VAX scale, which is kind of a score to measure how likely people are to vaccinate their children, appear to be linked to preference for online information. So you can see things are getting a little bit scary, and we're beginning to have real life consequences for online information right now. So going back to what we talked about, how search works, confirmation bias actually plays a major role in this. So when you head to your search engine and select your information, looking at it through a lens of confirmation bias, users will select the information that relates to their personal values and goals. Everybody does it. There's nothing that we can really do about it because everybody's biased. When it comes to looking at websites, searchers tend to explore irrelevant sites and look for information that confirms their existing beliefs. When it comes to evaluating information, the scary thing is that people are not motivated to critically verify online any information that they find and rely on subjective characteristics to decide if it's trustworthy. And these subjective characteristics are things like, for example, is the website fast at loading? Is the website new? Does it have a good domain? All of these kind of things that we optimize for, but we forget to look at if the information is correct. Why does this happen? Well, users tend to share and like information without properly checking its credibility. I did some experiments recently, and people do not fact check everything that they find online, which is where this happens. What's even worse is that users often knowingly share misinformation that confirms their pre-existing views. And users also uncritically accept online friends' recommendations as a form of self-justification. And this is where this social identity theory comes in. because people get a sense of self-worth from being part of their social group. It makes them feel good, and they want to share their friends' views or beliefs because, you know, they want to be part of that group. But you can see it does have these side effects. Again, just to reiterate why this happens, confirmation bias, because people go to great lengths to avoid disconfirming experiences. It makes people feel uncomfortable, they don't like it, and people will go to great lengths to make sure that that doesn't happen. It also comes down to identity, because people's beliefs are linked to their identity, and people often share because of identity signaling. And then we've got epistemology, where people need to be open about knowledge and sharing and attempts to correct untrue facts. However, unfortunately, there's a lack of knowledge around. People aren't always willing to listen to their views being corrected. So again, you can see where this is getting a bit problematic. Again, if we dive deeper, why is this happening on the internet? Well, when I was little, when I was a kid, for example, if people wanted information about vaccines, they'd have to go to their doctor's surgery. They would have to get, printed off information, and this would be, written by professionals. It would be fact-checked. It would be controlled by, medical bodies and things like that. However, online, information isn't centrally controlled, and anybody can become an author. So even people with no experience whatsoever can become an author. They can write these websites, and people can fall into these traps of listening or reading this information that isn't exactly true. And we can see that again in the SEO world, that, we often have medical clients. We either write it in-house or we send it to freelancers. And again, we don't have QA controls in place very often, because we just want to get the content out there. We want to rank. That's the main, KPI that we have. And unfortunately, incorrect information can be shared on a very large scale. So again, this is why things spread like wildfire, and you have social media, and not a good mix. But how does this link to SEO? So I read a couple of papers that did some experiments on the impact of confirmation bias on online searches. And they did a couple of experiments which were really interesting. It involved giving people keywords, getting them to look at kind of the SERPs that they received based on these keywords, and seeing if the SERPs changed if they tweak the keywords a little bit. So me being me, my critical thinking that has been drilled into me throughout a psychology degree, I decided to test it and see if it was really true. So I started off with the keyword that was mentioned in this paper that took a look at link between coffee and hypertension. So the first one I looked at was no link between coffee and hypertension, and as you can see in the featured snippet, it tells me caffeine doesn't have a long-term effect on their blood pressure, so therefore there is no link between coffee and hypertension. Brilliant. Okay. Then I decided to look at link between coffee and hypertension, and this is where things start to get confusing, because it says caffeine may cause a short but dramatic increase in your blood pressure, even if you don't have high blood pressure. So it completely goes against what I just read a second ago. It confirms my belief, again, confirmation bias, and the problem is that these are both the same websites, they are both the same URLs, yet I'm getting completely different information, and it's not clear which one is correct. And Google is just feeding us, the one that confirms our existing beliefs. So not off to a good start. So I decided to try something else. So this one's a little bit personal. This is kind of close to my heart. When my daughter was 8, when COVID first hit, she ended up in intensive care with COVID because it spread to her heart and had some pretty bad side effects. During that time, I was so annoyed listening to people saying, oh, but COVID doesn't impact children, when actually, that's not true. So decided to take a look at this and looked for children not getting seriously ill with COVID. And here you can see infants as young as children rarely develop severe or enduring symptoms of COVID-19, and those who do almost invariably suffer from some other serious medical problem. Again, this is not true. I know this is not true because of my personal situation, because of what doctors have told me and medical professionals have said as well. Yet, I'm getting the information that confirms my existing belief, which is kind of scary. I then took a look at, for example, the serious side effects of COVID in children. Well, you didn't get a featured snippet here. It does say children usually have mild or no symptoms, but some can develop severe symptoms or life-threatening inflammatory condition, which is what my daughter had, which is what we're seeing, which is what medical professionals are seeing. But yet, Google is feeding you the one that confirms your existing beliefs. So things are pretty bad. I decided to go all out and try something a little bit, out there. I didn't think that this would work, but hey ho, here we are. So I searched for, is ADHD caused by sugar? And the first thing that popped up was a warning saying sugar does not cause ADHD. So I was like, brilliant, thanks Google, we're off to a good start. I looked at the featured snippet and it says, in other words, people who consumed more sugar were more likely to have ADHD symptoms than those who didn't. So I moved on and took a look at ADHD not caused by sugar. Again, still got the same warning, which is good, but it says here, studies on the connection between sugar and ADHD have found little to no evidence that sugar influences ADHD symptoms. These are the same web pages, and yet the two different featured snippets are telling me two completely different things. And one is saying people who consumed more sugar were more likely to have ADHD symptoms. And also, little to no evidence has been found in studies stating that sugar influences ADHD symptoms. So it's like, which one is correct? Because you're giving me two completely different things. One's based on studies. I don't know what the other one is based on. But basically, yeah, it's confusing. It's not good. And it's even worse for, non-English results. I tried this out in Czech, and this one was quite shocking. This is a mum blog, and it says, is ADHD linked to food, which is what I searched for. Are you energized or, on the contrary, depressed, tired, and irritated? Sugar is to blame for everything. So if you read that and you're trying to look for information about ADHD, or you're scared of ADHD, or, you want to make sure that, your kid is not having too much sugar so they don't get ADHD, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, sugar is to blame for everything. Sugar causes ADHD. What makes it even more problematic is there's no warning on there. It's a mum blog right at the top, so it's not written by medical professionals or any qualified writers. And in the Czech Republic, we do not have the same level of maturity when it comes to neurodiversity. So therefore, people do not have the education or the knowledge to be able to sit down and go, that's not true. So this is where it's dangerous. And, Google, why are you not putting warnings on these kind of things in different languages? Because these are the countries or the language results where you actually really need the warnings, because it can be really dangerous and you're just, feeding people's uninformed beliefs. I also put in there, if there's, is there no link between ADHD and food? And again, same website. And it says, official research did not find a link between specific ingredients. So what is Google playing at? Because here it's telling you that sugar is to blame for everything. Here it's telling you there's no official research between ingredients and allergy. No official research between, specific ingredients and ADHD. So yeah, it is pretty bad and pretty problematic, which, yeah, I was hoping that Google would do something about it, but I did ask somebody that I know at Google. Unfortunately, they did tell me that they don't know who the people would be to get in touch with to ask about confirmation bias. So unfortunately, I am not feeling all that positive. And I did actually redo this study now, being a couple of months later from when I did this at Brighton, when I prepped this talk, and even more mum blogs are at the top of the results blaming sugar for ADHD in the Czech Republic. So pretty bad. So to take this a little bit further, I decided to look at something called cyberchondria. So cyberchondria is a disorder in which somebody searchers excessively for health information online, but rather than finding relief for their concerns, they diagnose themselves with a terrible disease and feel more anxious. So I know that I've done this before. I have Googled something. I've Googled why I have a migraine, for example, and diagnosed myself with a brain tumor. It's quite common. Lots of people do that, but for some people it's more extreme than others and does have some pretty bad side effects. When it comes to like the psychological impacts of this, Googling symptoms actually increases anxiety levels, and this in turn is actually making us sicker. Another thing that we need to look at as well is cyber searches are leading to increased medical costs. And all around the world, we're hearing about health services are so under pressure. They don't have budgets, they don't have money. We're dealing with an aging population. It's tough. And therefore, these health services need to focus on the people who are really sick and really need the help, rather than people who say might not need the help in the first place because of Googling their ailments. It gets even worse when you actually take a look at a study that has been done where medical professionals have said that 60% of medical information online is actually incorrect. But yet people don't have medical degrees and people don't understand, the difference. So people are unable to work out, what's correct, what's incorrect. And I've seen this a lot recently as well. My dog has just had puppies. If you follow me on social media, you will have seen all of the puppy spam. And some of the advice that I have got looking for, how to birth puppies and stuff like that has been diabolical. Yet it's out there. People have SEO'd for it. And you can tell that people have spent time and effort and money, getting people to SEO content like this. And it's even worse as well because searchers' levels of trust is really superficial. They are looking at, does the brand look authoritative? Is it trustworthy? Is the website new? Is the website quick? And you can begin what this is beginning to sound a lot like. It's like EAT. The problem is EAT does not take into account if things are wrong. It does not take into account, psychological problems like hypochondria or confirmation bias or anything like that. So, when we're going on about EAT, is it really a valid metric that we can take a look at? I don't think so, really. Because when you look in the greater scheme of things, it does not protect you from, some pretty serious things. And yes, I know that this slide looks funny. I forgot to put a comma in and then ended up realizing live on stage. So I just kept it in, just to be funny, relive that embarrassing moment. But back to the talk, as we've already mentioned, symptoms plus algorithm equals heightened anxiety. Anxiety is not good for people, It's normal that everybody suffers from a little bit of anxiety, but it can become extreme and you can have, for example, generalized anxiety disorder, and that's when it becomes a psychological problem. And this can be caused by hypochondria and Googling medical symptoms. Looking at other studies, a study done by two people, White and Horvitz, and they studied 40 million web pages. So it's quite a massive study, and they showed that a search of a common medical illness actually led to the search for more serious illness. And you can see how things are spiraling because people don't just Google one thing and leave it and say, okay, I have a cold. They dive deeper and they dive deeper and then they diagnose more. And 58% of people searching for medical information are looking for themselves, but more worryingly, 40% of people are actually looking for somebody else. So you have parents, for example, who are diagnosing their children based on what they found online and getting their children to go and have extra medical treatments they maybe didn't need. And there was one case that I read of, a very, very sad case actually, where she Googled some symptoms for an elderly relative. It suggested giving them X dose of a medication that she actually had. She gave that medication to the elderly person and it killed them. So this is where, SEO and SEO and content are not caring if things are correct, have real life consequences that can be fatal. And cyberchondria is also increased by AI SERP results because they're not correct. They're just spurting out information. You've seen some of the stuff that's online about, adding glue to the pizza and stuff like that. And also AI diagnostic tools that they have on websites are not helping. When I was in the UK a year or so ago, and I was sick, and the NHS pushed me towards a website, and they were like, go and, do the symptom checker on there. So you had to go through, and they were asking you, is your breathing getting faster? I didn't think it was, but then when you thought about it, it's like, oh my gosh, is my breathing getting faster? And you can see that this prompts people to think about new symptoms. This leads to psychosomatic effects, and it just increases panic among people. So we've talked about one, really sad story that happened because of this, but there are other real life consequences as well. That health related searches are increasing anxiety. This is leading to unnecessary medical visits and procedures, and in return this is also looking at, or this causes the increase in iatrogenic deaths, because more people are having unnecessary procedures, and therefore the likelihood that things can go wrong is increasing. And this also leads to misinformation as well. When we talk about people getting anxious and looking up information online, there are people who actually like to dwell on illnesses for attention. And this actually has a name. It's called Munchausen syndrome. And there's also Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is where, people like to dwell on illnesses for attention on behalf of, for example, their children. So parents, I wouldn't say faking, but thinking up, illnesses for their child, and then dragging their children around medical facilities when they're not really that ill. They're just doing it for attention, or because they suffer from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So yeah, the problem with this is that forums online are the perfect place for chronic complainers and people with real mental illnesses, like we've just talked about earlier. So there are people that spend all day looking into medical things and treatments, and spend all day, documenting their illness. The problem with this as well is it also, impacts perception, because you don't see anybody on the forum who got better. It's always people who are ill. So it just makes things look a lot worse. And as I've just mentioned, most people recover from the majority of illnesses, but you won't find people who have recovered on forums. And therefore, because you're constantly seeing online, the worst case scenario for these illnesses, people are thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to die because I have a headache. And this is also dangerous in another way as well, because people sharing advice on forums are not experts, and the advice that they're giving is often wrong, is often dangerous, and it's not given by medical professionals, and following this advice is dangerous. So yeah, you can now see why I'm so happy that Google formed a partnership with Reddit, and why when you make searches, especially, as I saw when I've been doing lots of puppy searches, when you look at how to give birth to a puppy, it's not advice from vets, it's advice from random people on Reddit who aren't particularly qualified in what they do. And I actually asked, I know quite a few vets, I asked them, is this actually true? Should you be doing that? And they were like, God, no, not at all. So, having Reddit, having Quora at the top of the search results, having this partnership, it's just a recipe for disaster, if I'm being completely honest. Just to make things worse, you've got availability bias in there, which is why things spread so quickly, because, we like information that happens quick. We like instant information, and we kind of take it at face value. So instead of looking all of the information, you only use a certain part of that information to make a decision, and you often focus on recent, frequent, extreme, or negative examples to make that decision, rather than, critically evaluating all the information that is there. So yeah, pretty deep, pretty scary stuff. But don't worry, there is stuff that we can do about it. So what we need to do as SEOs is we need to understand the limitations of the internet. We need to understand that the internet is funded by advertising revenue, and social media and technology and forums and all of this kind of stuff has been designed to retain our attention. So it's gonna make all of these problems worse, just by the way that it's been programmed. And unfortunately, money is what matters and sensational content sells. So, you know, we've got our work cut out here, and we're not going to be able to trust, Google or anybody to fix this for us, which is why we're kind of coming to the whole thing of our SEOs the last defense against misinformation, and do we have a moral obligation to do something against this misinformation? But again, when I was doing my research, I found this really nice quote, which I think is extremely true and vital that people understand. And it talks about the structural features of the internet will always encourage the circulation of content, not on the basis of its truthfulness, but on its capacity to generate more revenue. And that is so true. And you can see that with the decisions that maybe, say, Google will be making recently, because they're definitely not doing what's best for the searcher or what's, the most moral thing that they could be doing. Psychologists have been doing some tests to try and find ways around this and to do things about this. So one thing that they've been trying is nudging. So they've been trying to push people towards authoritative sources. And what Seznam, the search engine in the Czech Republic, said that they're doing is also trying to label misinformation as well, so that people have more, they're able to kind of make a more informed decision as to, is this real, is this not real? Is this, fake sort of thing. One online newspaper in Norway also started making people take tests before they could share the article or comment on it, because when you often go on online news, depending on the news outlet, you often get some of these, keyboard warrior figures where they take a look at the news, they read one sentence and then they go off and, get angry in the comments, and often stir a bit of hatred while they're at it. So making sure that users have understand the article, they've read everything before allowing them to take actions, worked quite well. And you've also got laws that, for example, like the EU or different countries are bringing in to protect users and fine providers. So I think we'll see a lot of that, in the future. Fingers crossed that something will be done about it. But as SEOs, as individuals, what can we do about it? So one thing that we can do is improve media literacy. So we need to think about sources. Where are we getting the information that we're using? Is it correct? Have you fact-checked it? Is it reputable? Not just from an EEAT perspective, but from an actual, source perspective as well. Everybody's biased. We need to be aware of our own biases. We need to be aware of confirmation bias. We need to make sure that we know what's going on. And rather than trying to, use confirmation bias as something that you hack, which is something that I've been asked quite a lot recently, you need to understand, it's not something that you can use for financial gain. It's something that happens and you need to deal with that ethically. Fact check everything that you do. So when you're creating content for new clients, fact check it to make sure that it's correct and it doesn't end up in the 60% of medical information online that is incorrect. You need to understand how search engine algorithms work, not from, an SEO perspective, from a money-making perspective, and how it works from the, user's perspective as well, because people don't sit down rationally. They don't type in keywords very in a rational process. They can be typing maybe in anger, and almost certainly they're looking to confirm their existing beliefs. You need to evaluate website quality, again, not just from SEO perspective, just to make sure that everything is actually correct. You also need to think about how keywords are phrased as well. So sometimes you can get keywords that are phrased in a particular way, and it means that people are looking for X information. So you need to, rather than just mining them, scraping them, and then going out with the content because they have search volume, think critically about them. Think, does this information need to be written? Does this piece of content, stir hatred? Is this a good keyword to write about? Because chances are, if you're not correcting them, there are going to be keywords that should not be written about. And just because somebody is searching for it doesn't mean you should be writing about it. With steps that we can take, make sure that we use qualified writers. So I'm not saying just using a copywriter who can do everything. I could not, write an article on neuroscience or something, because I'm not qualified in that area. However, I could write something about psychology. We often say that when you're looking at research papers in psychology, you can often tell when a doctor's written it because they don't understand the psychology behind it. So again, make sure you use experts from that industry who are able to write something that is correct, or at least get people to check it. We need to think before we mass produce content because, AI is biased. AI contains an awful lot of biases, and we don't want that going into our content. So again, think before you mass produce content and look at things, ethically. Evaluate the keywords that we choose, make sure that they're, suitable to be chosen. Understand there's more to algorithms and SEO, and also most importantly, we need to educate ourselves and our team. We need to understand, the psychology that goes on behind in search. There's quite a lot of people, sadly, who think that, search and psychology have nothing to do with each other. They do. Search is all about user behavior. When you're doing marketing, everything is about psychology. You need to understand that, and you also need to make sure that every single member on your team, even the juniors, even the bosses, everybody understands these kind of biases and the, consequences of not taking this kind of stuff seriously, because, it's bad. So leaving on a slightly more positive note, let's save the internet rather than ruining it, and let's not be dicks. Thank you. And if anybody would like to connect with me after this, you've got my email address, you've got my LinkedIn, and you've got my Twitter. Don't go on Twitter, go on LinkedIn. That's maybe where you can find me. But hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully it was eye-opening.